everybody. This is Eve Ewing. I'm the curator of the Black Freedom Lecture Series. And before we get started with our amazing talk this week, there are two things I want to remind you to do. The first thing is, if you are not already signed up for our newsletter, you definitely want to do that. It's how you're going to find out about all of our incredible speakers and enter a raffle to win books and find out about questions and readings and all the cool stuff. So go to our website, blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter, and sign up if you haven't done that already. The second thing is, we would really love this to be a collective learning experience. So if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to get together with a squad, a group of friends, or just one friend. Hook up with somebody and say, hey, I'm watching this thing, I'm reading this stuff, and I would love to have some conversations with you about it. Get together so that this is not a thing we're doing alone. That's it. Welcome. Really geeked to have you, and let's get into it.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to the Black Freedoms Lecture. I am Dr. Christina Greer. I'm a associate professor of political science and American studies at Fordham University in New York City. And today I'll mainly be talking to you about my book, Black Ethnics, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion on April 22nd, where hopefully I can answer any and all questions. So, the title of my talk is Blackness, Immigration, and Ethnic Identities. And since I wrote this book that was published in 2013 on Oxford University Press, I want to thank Eve and her staff for inviting me to discuss the book and then some larger conversations we're having as we move more into the 21st century. And so this is in preparation for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. So this book came about as an extension of my dissertation at Columbia University in the political science department, where I was tasked with replicating someone's data. And as I was walking through that experiment, I decided to play with some extra variables, and I put in a parent nativity variable when it came to ideas about welfare and the social welfare state and welfare policy. And what I found was there was sort of a crisscross when it came to white ethnics and Black ethnics, in that white ethnics, people whose parents were born in the United States, tended to be against the welfare state, and white immigrants tended to be for it. And then Black native born were for the welfare state, and Black immigrants were against it. So the data sort of went crisscross. Now, it wasn't substantive, but I knew that I had some sort of conversation there. And having gone to different schools with people from the continent of Africa and various countries throughout the Caribbean, I knew that there was this shared identity we had as Black people. But there were also some distinct nuances that occurred in our neighborhoods, in our family structures. And I was interested in sort of parsing that out, because so much of the political science literature talked about Black people without really giving a little nuance and dissecting the data to look at all of our generational diversity as well as our ethnic diversity from various countries, to say nothing about religious and language diversity as well. And so I start the book off talking about an experience I had at Tufts University, which was my undergraduate institution in the city of Medford, Massachusetts, right outside of Boston. And the Black students at Tufts at the time were the largest Black class, was 60 of us out of 1,200. And we were invited to go to Cape Cod before school started, the week before school started, to just talk about Boston and racism and what we would experience at this predominantly white institution, which I call HWCUs. We know HBCUs are Howard and Hampton, Spelman and Morehouse, and 100 other, literally 100 other HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And I like to say I went to an HWCU because HBCUs are set up for the production of knowledge and excellence of Black people. And I've gone to universities that were set up for the production and knowledge of white folks. I just happened to be there. So when we were on the Cape, the facilitator asked us to close our eyes, which we all did. And he said, now raise your hand if your parents told you when you get to Tufts, don't be messing around with those Black folks. So I thought that was a relatively odd question to ask. So I opened up my eyes and I realized that everyone's hands were raised except for the 6 Black Americans who were on the trip. So there were a few things that I was curious about. One, almost everyone on the trip identified as a Black ethnic in some sort. They were Caribbean and Black American. And two, that there was some conversation that African and Caribbean parents were having with their kids before they came to this institution. So that sort of started this conversation that I'd have with friends, and then it turned into this intellectual project over the years. So that's the backdrop. I will say I'm working on sort of two other projects. One is on I call it symbolic candidacies and the significance of alternative candidates, the African American Road to the Executive Office, 1872 to 2008. I look at all of the Black people who have run for the presidency or been nominated, so roughly from Frederick Douglass to Barack Obama. And the second project that I'm working on that I'm finishing up now, we can talk about this during the Q&A if you all are interested. It's a Black women in the U.S. South narrative. I haven't gotten a title for it just yet, but it's about Barbara Jordan, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Stacey Abrams and politics and organizing in the U.S. South. So some of you may know that Barbara Jordan is the second Black woman to serve in U.S. Congress. Shirley Chisholm was the first from the state of New York. Barbara Jordan was the second from the state of Texas, but the first Black woman from the South. Fannie Lou Hamer, some of you may know, was an organizer from Mississippi, most famous for some of the speeches she gave at the DNC and her relationship with organizers across the U.S. South. And then Stacey Abrams, who many of you may know, from Georgia, who ran for the governorship in 2018, narrowly lost, or possibly had the election stolen from her, which I will go to the grave believing. But sort of I argue that Barbara Jordan and Fannie Lou Hamer and their efforts from the 1960s really did contribute 50 years later to someone like Stacey Abrams, all of them Black American women from the U.S. South, and so how they have utilized politics and organizing to push forward an agenda for Black people, Black women specifically. And so the legacy and importance of these three women, since many people know about one, but not necessarily all three. So I'm more than happy to talk about that when we reconvene as well. And it's interesting because lots of people are writing stories right now about Shirley Chisholm to Kamala Harris, an important story, and it actually dovetails onto this conversation that we're going to have today because Shirley Chisholm was the first Black woman in U.S. Congress. She was elected to the House of Representatives in 1968 for the state of New York. And then, as you all know, that Kamala Harris was only the second Black American woman to ever serve as a U.S. Senator from the state of California. We know that Carol Moseley Braun was the first Black woman to ever be a U.S. Senator from the state of Illinois. She was elected in 1992. And then we had a gap. She was there for one term, which is 6 years. Then there was a gap, and then Kamala Harris was elected in 2016. And so the importance of Kamala Harris being elected and obviously becoming the vice president of the United States, the first woman to do so, the first woman of color to do so, representing not just African Americans, but also Indian Americans as well. But I think it is important, it should be noted, that Shirley Chisholm and Kamala Harris are both children of immigrants, as is Barack Obama. So it shouldn't be lost on us that the two Black people who've served at the highest levels of office, the executive level at Barack Obama as the president and Kamala Harris as the vice president, neither one of them are descendants of U.S. chattel slavery. Both of them have parents who were born outside the United States. And I do think that that's worthy of a conversation because if we think about someone like Jesse Jackson, who ran in 84 and 88 and came very close, he's also a reminder of the real history of this country that is rooted in white supremacy, anti-Black racism, patriarchy, and racialized capitalism that many Americans would rather forget. So, in thinking about this line of questioning about immigration and Blackness and where we are, sort of Blackness, immigration, and ethnic identities, I'm asking the question, sort of why this line of question? Why are we having a 21st century conversation about race in American politics? So I argue that immigration is increasing, and so it's having real effects on how we think about racial, ethnic, and demographic changes in the United States, not just from documented populations. But we also have to remember when we think about the undocumented populations, oftentimes the face of those populations are people from Central America and Latin America. However, of the people in detention centers, we know a large percentage are from the Caribbean, from Haiti in particular. And even though Blacks make up roughly 10% of the undocumented population in the United States, they represent roughly 20% of the deportations. And because of residential segregation of Black immigrants living in communities in close proximity to Black Americans, because those communities are hyper policed, because of things like stop and frisk, what could be a simple stop and frisk for possible marijuana can turn into a full on ICE charge when it comes to a Black community. And we know that obviously removing people from a community not doesn't just have psychological effects, but real economic effects as well. So that's one of the conversations I wanted to have. The second one was about participation and incorporation complexities. Will we see Black immigrants participating at the same rates as Black Americans? We know that Black Americans overperform at the ballot box despite voter disenfranchisement efforts, right? Despite all of the ways in which state governments make it harder for Black people to participate, we see that Black immigrants are incorporating themselves slowly but surely into the political process. But depending on the city or the state, many Black ethnic populations are still more concerned with their home country politics than real world politics in the United States. And so there's this disconnect. Even if people don't plan on going home, they see home as their primary when it comes to a political space. I was also curious in writing this book and doing some research as to why is it that the Republican Party has cast their lot with a white nationalist agenda when, quite honestly, they could really clean up if they actually marketed themselves to Black ethnics who tend to be more conservative when it comes to certain social and even economic issues. What I find fascinating about the politics of Black Americans is that when in a presidential election, we know that roughly 91% of Black Americans vote for the Democratic Party candidate. That number is a little bit smaller on local elections just because politics is a little more local and people tend to identify with a candidate more so than a party sometimes on a local level. But for presidential elections, we know that Black American women are immune to the Republican Party. They vote for the Democratic Party candidate roughly 96%. And so Black men roughly 88%, thus making the average close to 91% over time. But what's so interesting is all of the ideological diversity of Black people is kind of trapped into one party because Republicans have chosen not to talk about Black issues, not to sort of reach out to Black people in a substantive way. So even if Black Americans might disagree with Democratic Party candidates on pretty substantive issues, they still vote within the party because that party still represents them better than the Republican Party when it comes to just downright racism. So it'd be fascinating to see if the Republican Party could actually get themselves together and tap into a more Black conservative space. And there was a hint of a question: will Black people run to the Republican Party in 2020? It has not happened, right? Lots of people said Black men would. They did not, actually, if you look at the data. And it's largely because of the white nationalist agenda of the Republican Party and their refusal to recognize the ideological diversity of Black people. Most Black Americans are not progressive at all when we look at the data and see their political spectrum. And that means most Black Americans are not far left leaning because Black Americans have to think about the attitudes and behaviors of white voters as well and be strategic in the candidates they choose. And oftentimes that does not sort of shake out into a candidate that's far left in a party. I also wanted to look at Black ethnics and immigration and Black identity because of the ramifications for the allocation of resources and representation. And so there's this, oftentimes we talk about scarce resources in the United States. It's a perception of scarce resources. We have abundance of resources, right? If we wanted to go to war tomorrow, we totally could. We have the money. We just don't dole it out in ways that we could and should. And so when you have communities competing for resources, what does that mean when there's a sense of competition against another group? So instead of working together, why is it that certain groups are buttressed together? And then lastly, I was curious about the shifting and blurring of the color line, as W.B. Du Bois talked about the color line. And it's getting a little more blurry when we have this nuanced understanding of what it means to be Black, when we have more than just Black and white groups in a dichotomous relationship. So that's kind of where I wanted to start with some of this questioning, because we know that Black Americans are this rich and dynamic group of people, but I was also really fascinated because separate from Native American populations, Black Americans are the only group in the United States who are not voluntary immigrants. They did not come here seeking a better life with a suitcase and a dream. They were brought here through the process of chattel slavery to uphold an economic institution and build a nation for free. So what happens when you have other people who look like you generations later coming to this very same nation with a suitcase and a dream and believing in the substance of a country that has been quite cruel and harsh on a host of levels. So when I wrote the book, uh, my data is from 2005 because that's when I was in graduate school. The gray hair can attest. The book was published in 2013. I mentioned Du Bois. It's the winner of the W.B. Du Bois Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists because I actually extended this conversation of Black identity and Black ethnicity in ways that we just hadn't seen before. And so the Black population right now, back then it was 12%, now it's roughly 13%. But Black Americans, or Blacks in America, have moved from being the second largest group in the nation to the third largest group. And so it's now white Americans first, Latinx population second, and now Black Americans third. And so that even created an interesting conversation with this idea of Blacks coming to the United States, but still not creating the same number of folks to maintain the second place status. And so now it's third place and slowly falling behind the growing Latinx and actually Asian American population. The number of undocumented Asian Americans is incredibly large and growing by the moment. And so I chose to look at New York City as a way to expand this conversation of Black ethnicity because New York City has such a diverse Black ethnic group. So not just historically, we can think about Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance and all of the Caribbeans who interacted with Black Americans who came in from the Great Migration. But we know that in Brooklyn, it's basically a mini microcosm of the entire Caribbean. If anyone's ever been to the Caribbean Day Parade or gone to various neighborhoods throughout Brooklyn, we know that there's first, second, third generation folks from the Caribbean. So I was looking at the total US population, the population of Black folks, which when I was doing my study was about 35 million, now it's about 40 million, and then the total foreign-born Black population. At the time when I was doing my study, Africans was about 1.25 million, and for Afro-Caribbeans, 2.25 million. That number is a little dodgy just because, one, we have undocumented populations, and two, how people choose to self-identify can make our data just a little questionable, especially if we don't ask follow-up questions about where both of your parents were born or your grandparents. And those were questions that I asked when I was getting my data. But depending on the type of neighborhood you live in, if you live with a large group of say Black people, you may say, well, I am Jamaican, I am Nigerian, and these are all the diverse Black people I live with. If you live in a community with a very small percentage of Black people, you may just say that you're Black because everyone else around you, the few people are around you, are Black as well. And so the safety in numbers. And so I'm really interested in kind of getting to the idea of what would it take for us to really have substantive coalition building as we get this influx of diverse immigrants coming to the United States with a different mindset about what this country can and cannot do. But how do we work together and not just sort of an electoral space, but also obviously in an economic space. But we know that there's this little idea called descriptive versus substantive representation when we think about elected officials. And so how do we not only get someone who looks like us, but substantively represents us? And that gets a little more complicated when you have communities that are both Black and also immigrant. And so do you want someone who's a representative who's just Black? Or do you want someone who's Black and also an immigrant, but how do they best represent the entire community? So those were some of the questions that I try and answer in Black Ethnics, but that I think about as we move forward in the 21st century and think about Black leadership, especially Black mayors. So the total Black population in 2005, when I did the study, was about 35 million. The Black population in New York State was almost 3 million, and the Black population in New York City was about 2 million, 2 million out of roughly 8 million people. And so as we were looking at this Black population, and again, trying to figure out the numbers of Africans and Caribbeans can be a little difficult because of how people self-identify, because of undocumented status. I was really thinking also, in New York, we oftentimes talk about sort of black and white. We've had one black mayor in the history of our city. We're on our 109th mayor now, and only one has been non-white, and that's David Dinkins, who was elected in 1989. And so oftentimes the 20th century color line that W.B. Du Bois spoke about is this black-white paradigm between blacks and whites, but we can look at, places like Georgia, New York City, Los Angeles, Chicago, and there's this emerging black, white, Latinx, Asian paradigm where it's a much more complicated story about what the color line looks like because we have so many other racial and ethnic groups with varying immigrant statuses sort of working together, but also competing for resources at times. And what does that mean for leadership and how people choose leaders? So I oftentimes think about LA getting their first Latinx mayor, Mayor Villagrosa, because for so many years, white candidates sort of went to black voters and said, if we get a Latinx mayor, you'll get nothing, so stick with us. And then finally, black voters decided, let's take a chance with the Latinx mayor and see, because we're clearly not getting anything with white mayors. So how this triangular relationship between blacks, whites, and Latinx folks plays out, and also now black, white, Latinx, and Asian folks, depending on the city. So I chose a union as my basis of data, largely because I wanted to have a constant in occupation. And so everyone at the union does not the same work, but roughly similar work. They're all insured, they all have sort of salaries, and they're all a social services employees union, because we know that when we look at varying immigrants, some people were doctors in their home country and taxi cab drivers now, but I didn't want to compare, say, taxi cab drivers and nannies to dentists to engineers to professors, because some of that diversity that I might see in opinions might have to do more with class and economic status than actual ethnicity. So I was trying to actually keep occupation and class relatively stable. So then when I got a diversity of opinions, that would be more of a constant. And so the three central questions that I asked that we can delve into during the Q&A on the 22nd was, how significant are Black ethnic distinctions for populations living in the United States? Will participatory distinctions in voting campaigns and other political behaviors exist? And how will native-born and foreign-born Blacks view government effectiveness and opportunities for full incorporation? So those are some of the questions that I answer in the text. And so here's some of my hypotheses. I thought that ethnicity would affect attitudes and opinions, and I thought that Black Americans would be the most liberal, and Africans would be the most conservative, and Afro Caribbeans would be in the middle and sort of moderate. I thought foreign-born populations would be more participatory, just because they were active and excited about their new status as Americans, and I thought that Black ethnic populations would express more positive feelings toward the government because they are voluntary immigrants to the United States. And so, to try and get at these questions, I conducted my own survey with the Social Services Employees Union, Local 371 in New York. I sent out surveys to respondents. So, if there are any students who want to talk about data collection and what it means to do that as a graduate student on a shoestring budget, I'm more than happy to talk about that. And some of the questions that I have, I base them on national survey data from the National Election Study, the General Social Survey, and a New American Exit Poll, so that I could compare my data to some of the pooled resource data from the larger data sets. The reason why I couldn't use larger data sets is because none of them really had enough Black people in the population to actually get at sort of Africans, Caribbeans, and Black Americans, because we know we're notoriously undersampled. And then sadly, when I looked at some of the data collected by Black entities that many Black American political scientists had used over time, of the National Black Election Study that had been done in 3 panels, they did not ask the ethnicity question. There was no question on there about Black ethnicity or Black immigration. And so that further solidified my frustration with this idea that even Black scholars were looking at Black participation and Black political attitudes as this homogenous group, when we know for a fact that it's not. Right? Not every Black person in this country is Baptist, descendant of, U.S. chattel slavery, participated in the Great Migration, etc. We know that there's great diversity and a whole host of levels in the Black community. And then I conducted some qualitative interviews with members of the union, sort of open-ended interviews with rank and file. And so what did I find? So some of my main findings are thus. I found that ethnicity does affect attitudes toward the American dream. And so by the American dream, I looked at some sociologists who had really talked about what it is that America can provide for you. What do you feel as though she owes to you? Feelings of incorporation. Can I actually be in this country and succeed and do well? And then some other spending issues on various things like immigration, war, social security, education, things like that. And so only certain Black ethnic populations express positive feelings toward the government and investment in the American dream. And here's where I was actually a little shocked, and my hypotheses did not hold. I found that Africans were the most eager to believe in the American dream. I believe that. That's what I put in my hypotheses and sort of created theories as to. Obviously, many people don't have what Ruel Rogers from Northwestern University argues as an exit option. Many people come and there's no plan to return back to their home country. So they're fully invested in making their relationship with America work. That holds. But where my hypothesis didn't hold was Black Americans were in the center and Afro Caribbeans were the least likely to believe in the American dream. And that I wasn't expecting. And so through my interviews and further research, I realized there's a chapter where essentially we say you win some, you lose some. And many Black Americans realize in this country, you could have a daughter who's a professor and with an Ivy League education. You can have a nephew or a son who's incarcerated for having a small amount of marijuana, when he's with his friends in high school. I mean, this is just the way the country is, right? You can go to work every day and have a nice little timeshare and nice little home in a nice neighborhood, or you get shot going to the grocery store because some vigilante or some police officer is trigger happy. And so this idea that the country gives and takes away freely, where there's opportunity and then there isn't, right? All within sometimes the same family, not even the same neighborhood. That's where Black Americans were. Whereas with Afro Caribbeans, the reason why they weren't invested in this idea of the American dream is that many of them expressed, especially second generation Afro Caribbeans, were saying, well, I came here at the same time as someone from Korea or from Italy or from any other non Caribbean or non African nation. And why is it that I am not able to advance in the same ways and as quickly? And it's because my Black skin is holding me back because of the racist institutions and the anti-Black notions in this nation. And so the frustration of the residential segregation, not that they didn't want to be with other Black people, but seeing the frustration of other non-Black immigrants were able to incorporate into this non-Blackness much more easily. So whereas before, before the Irish were able to become white and the Italians were able to become white and Jews were able to become white and all the other groups from Europe, it was sort of whites and non-whites. And everybody else was in this non-white category, except for sort of the framers and the founding fathers and those folks. And now, looking at immigrants, is almost a conversation of Blacks and non-Blacks, right? So you have Black Americans who are perceived to be last place, and you have everyone else fighting not to be in that category. So what does that do to relationships with Black Americans when it seems that everyone's scurrying not to be with them? So I found that race and ethnicity matter for Black ethnics. So just as when I was at Tufts, I was an active member of what we called it, you all would most likely know as a BSA, a Black Student Association. We called it the Pan-African Alliance, which already shows that Tufts was thinking about ways to sort of incorporate people who were not necessarily descendants of U.S. chattel slavery and Black Americans. But so as an active member of our BSA, which is our PAA, folks at Tufts broke off and formed two other groups while I was a student there. So there was the Caribbean Association, and then there was the African Student Association. But what was so fascinating is the Caribbean students, even though they had the Caribbean Association, the African students, even though they had the African Students Association, they still maintained membership within the BSA. So it was both and, recognizing that sometimes there were some issues that they wanted to talk about and think about. There were some cultural events that they wanted to host that were just for them in their space where they could invite others, but then also being members of the BSA. So it was this duality. And so I found in my research that race and ethnicity matter for Black ethnics. So although there are varying Black ethnic attitudes regarding modes of success and achievement efforts, there's a significant Black racial identity present among native-born and foreign-born populations once they're in the United States. I also found that Black ethnicity, Black ethnic participatory tendencies, intraracial perceptions, so perceptions within Black ethnic groups, and policy stances directly affect the potential for coalition building. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm concerned with as a scholar and as a Black person, right? Not who's smarter, who incorporates faster or better. It's how can we work together in a nation that's predicated on white supremacy and anti-Black racism. Because we know that police officers don't ask what your country of origin is if they're going to shoot you, right? They're not interested if you're Ghanaian or, a descendant of the Great Migration, if they're going to be trigger happy to you or someone you love. And so the most effective coalition building took place when I presented it as an interracial idea, which is a Black versus white idea. And that's where we got the most substantive coalition building. So here's some takeaways I want you all to think about, and then we can hopefully have a robust conversation when we reconvene in a few weeks. There seemed to be this mandatory Black prefix for Black immigrants, where that was part of the frustration, where they could not just become Americans like other groups. They became Black Americans, which has a connotation, as we know, because Black Americans, like many other racial and ethnic groups, because of the history of white supremacy in this nation, are seen as last place. And so when Black immigrants are coming to this country, they don't just get to become immigrants, they're Black immigrants. They don't just get to be American, they're Black American. And so we're starting to see these different modes of assimilation, people keeping their last names as opposed to oftentimes with white immigrants, we saw people get rid of their last names quickly and try and assimilate and integrate very, very quickly. And for Black Americans, oftentimes that because of Black skin, that integration process with Black America sort of put them in these segregated spaces, but to differentiate themselves, they chose to keep an immigrantness about them. And that's something that we had not previously seen in other immigrant groups. And that was a relatively new phenomenon. I also created this idea of the elevated minority status. So you all have probably heard of the model minority status when it comes to Asian Americans, white Americans seeing them as special minorities and smarter and better at things. In some ways, when looking at white Americans, they do see Black ethnics and Black immigrants as elevated and above Black Americans, but definitely not as model minorities. And so, what does that then mean to be in this sort of weird space of being better than one group that looks like you, but also never being able to achieve sort of the same welcoming principles as other immigrants who don't look like you? Um, as I mentioned before, this idea of an exit option affected how people viewed their circumstance. So, if people were from home countries, Black immigrants are from home countries where they quite honestly can't go back easily, either because of political turmoil and violence, or now, sadly, because of the environment and some of the horrible hurricanes that we've seen sort of decimating various countries in the Caribbean and making it very difficult for people to have a living there, or as we know, because of climate change in particular countries on the continent, making it very difficult for people to resettle back in their home country. This idea of an exit option really does affect how Black immigrants see their prospects in the United States. And then lastly, I want us to always remember that immigrant selection is a real process, right? And so it's not very easy to get to this country, especially as a Black person. And so we have to always remember that there are political, economic, and social networks that allow people to get here. So with Black Americans, we're looking at the entire orchard, A through Z. But when we look at Black immigrants, we're only looking at select bushels of people who were able to come to the United States, oftentimes during multi-stage migration, stopping off in other countries before they get to the United States. But this is a very real process that shouldn't be taken lightly. So, lastly, I think I'm going to save some other questions for when we get together, but I just want you all to remember that we've got changing demographics in the United States. This has real world implications for political representation, not just for how people campaign, but how people want to be represented. There are larger questions surrounding descriptive versus substantive representation. Is it enough that someone just looks like me, or do they substantively need to represent my ideas and values? But as we become much more diverse as Black people, what does that mean as substantive representation grows? How do you sort of manage all of these different ideas? I want us to rethink race and identity politics and coalition building, and substantive coalition building is really the key. but also thinking about sometimes there's short-term coalitions that we build to get through certain instances, but then also what are these long-term coalitions that we need to build to combat whether it's white supremacy or police violence or education inequities or climate change and public health, right? Or housing, whatever it may be. How do we build these long-standing coalitions to level the playing field for Black people in this country, immigrant and otherwise? And then lastly, I'm a political scientist, and so this was a call to my field as Black ethnics was just the beginning of a conversation I wanted to have about the ethnic diversity of Black people in this country. So I'm going to pause there. Thank you again for having me. I'm so looking forward to answering your questions. And thank you, Eve and staff, for putting this together. And I shall see everyone on April 22nd. You've been listening to Christina Greer, Associate Professor of Political Science at Fordham University.